Season 2 of The Rings of Power was an absolute triumph for Isildur's horse. Yes, you heard that right. Even the horse is a character in this one, and a very important one. We return to him in much distress at the potential loss of his brave master. He runs away from the Númenóreans on a perilous mission to find and save Isildur. He is nearly captured by orcs, but manages to slay one with a valiant kick and avoids capture by dragging another into a tree stump. It's a triumphant high point for the Rings of Power. Things are happening and making sense. But they got one key part wrong. It's about a horse, not a great hero. He then dashes off into the Black Forest, a place of much danger. And am I really talking about a horse? Why, yes, I'm afraid I am. He wanders a short while, still desperately looking for his master, valiantly ignoring the grave danger he has wandered into. And I've thrown all critical thinking to the wind here and am just rooting for the horse. I mean, at this rate, he might be the brave leader of the last army of men and elves, and he might actually slice off Sauron's finger. Finally, he meets Isildur, who is wrapped up in a giant spider web. This is by far the best moments of Isildur's arc, and no, they don't even belong to him at all. As the action has subsided, something unfortunate happens. I begin thinking again. How did the horse know Isildur was here? How did Isildur even get here? I have to be careful. This is how the Rings of Power overwhelms you, and after a fit of despair, you give up reviewing and analyzing it. Let's take this question first. How did the horse know where Isildur was? We know from Season 1 that the horse and the rider form a deep psychic bond, but that doesn't mean he suddenly develops a radar or magical sense of finding and can always locate Isildur. In fact, I know this isn't the case because the one thing Rings of Power never, and I mean never misses, is a chance to do an exposition dump right on your face. So if they wanted me to know there was a psychic bond and his horse could always find Isildur, trust me, they would have told me in a pointless blabbing session from Elendil, probably talking to the horse about its own magical abilities, enabling it to find its rider. However, it must also be considered that the Rings of Power is exceptionally stupid, and that in this one instance where they absolutely needed to exposition dump, they absolutely forgot. Dear God, there's an even worse thing I haven't even considered. It's all just a shitty illusion to when Aragorn's horse saves him. Now let's consider how Isildur got from a burning home to the spider's cave. Did the spiders drag him all this way? After all, this is a giant forest which is far removed from the town where a volcano literally destroyed everything for hundreds of miles. If they are dragging victims for hundreds of miles, then they are more dangerous than an army of orcs, and Adar should be trying to recruit them to his cause or outright destroy them because they're slowly going to consume his army. Also, spiders hate fire, so I doubt they would be going out of their way to abduct people from burning homes. Now, if a train of spiders were carrying off bodies and unconscious victims, I think word would have gotten out and the Númenórean knights would have a big reason to stay and vanquish these evil baby spiders and their evil brood mother, or at least die trying, as is the fate of many a brave knight in the fantasy genre. This would have been an interesting and actiony storyline, especially for the fantasy genre, so we know the writers of the Rings of Power absolutely did not even consider writing this. So we can only surmise that yes, Isildur succumbed in a burning building, but miraculously survived only to be carried away by a band of spiders some distance to their lair. No one saw this great train of spiders, and that yes, the Rings of Power writers are all very stupid. Now, in analyzing the Rings of Power storytelling, you really only need to focus on one thing. Can they or can't they make a reference to the original trilogy? And to be honest, even if they can't, that never really stops them, which is the case here. The primary force in writing the story really seems to have been how can we basically retell the Lord of the Rings original trilogy movie, even though we paid $1 billion for a different set of lore. And because of that logic, they need to slip in a reference to Shelob. But since they don't have the rights to that lore, they can't even show her. But not to be deterred, they can show a larger spider and have Shelob lurking off screen, just to try and score some of those empty reference points that audiences absolutely hate now, but which is the main tactic Rings of Power uses to tell a story it doesn't even own. You would think this would cause them to cut this line of story altogether and force them to pursue a unique story, but you'd be underestimating the sheer stupidity of the Rings of Power. So after stomping a few spiders, Isildur jumped on his horse and they race away, but not to safety. Oh no. There is so much more danger ahead because the Rings of Power riding room is just warming up. Isildur and his brave horse wander through a black marsh and a black forest. He sees a dead soldier in a pool, just like Frodo did when he was on an actual quest to destroy the ring. I mean, I just got finished saying this, but do they know that every time they remind me of the original trilogy, that it actually makes it crystal clear just how incredibly terrible this show is in comparison? Like, member berries aren't the free ticket to nostalgia and good vibes that all these corrupt studios think they are. I put aside my rage and think, okay, this could actually be a great opportunity for the Rings of Power to take me on a thrilling adventure of swordsmanship and slaughter. This could be like The Road by Cormac McCarthy, but Lord of the Rings style. A hectic ride through Mordor as Isildur desperately hacks and slashes his way from Mordor to the coast to be rescued by his father, leaving the chopped up bodies of corrupt men, orcs, and hopefully those spiders in his wake. Lore has never been allowed to stand in the way anything in Rings of Power. Now would be a good time to depart from it as any. As we walk through the wastelands and my hope slowly recedes into the muds of Mordor, Isildur comes across an abandoned camp. Since something needs to happen, he gets stabbed in the thigh. There are stupid decisions, and then there are Rings of Power decisions. Rings of Power characters always make the decision that leads to the most ridiculous outcome. In this case, it's doubly ridiculous. Not only does Isildur get stabbed in the thigh because he didn't look inside the tent first, using his sword to safely pull back the cloth from a safe distance, but instead of killing his assailant, this actually becomes a character introduction. You really shouldn't be introducing more and more characters when you can't even adequately handle the ones you've paid a literal $1 billion for. But the real twist of the knife is just moments away. You see, perhaps the only thing more terrible than the story in the Rings of Power is dialogue. They engage in universe shattering conversation.
You're meant to leave it in.
Was I?
Yes, whenever you're stabbed, you're meant to leave it in.
I've never been stabbed before.
Oh, neither have I.
This is something I would expect from an office style mockery of what it's like to get stabbed in the leg in a fantasy universe, not an actual J.R.R. Tolkien story set in the second age that is aspiring to be prestige TV and write a golden song that will ring out across the ages. I mean, my first question to anyone in these lands would be, what's up with the fucking spiders? Did your entire camp get carried off by them in the dark of the night? How come they didn't kidnap you? And to myself, I'd ask, can I really trust anyone who hasn't been carried away by the spiders? What did they offer them in exchange for their life? Can this person really be trusted since they very, very likely made a dark deal with the spiders? Is this Shelob in finer form? Of course, none of this happens except that she reveals her future husband has gone missing. Oh yeah, and actually I almost forgot because I simply didn't believe it. Steady yourself because you're about to witness the most important moments of the entire series, and in a way, one of the most important moments of anything that happens in all of the Lord of the Rings. Estrid, that's this dumb girl's name, Estrid reveals that she has a map, which in a moment you will discover is the most important map in all of Middle-earth. Because if Isildur didn't get this map, there's no reason to believe that he wouldn't simply die out here. There's no reason to believe he doesn't get overwhelmed by the orcs and just starve to death. His own father, a seasoned warrior, simply left him for dead based off these odds alone. He doesn't even try to go mount a search party for him. That's not me just making ridiculous conjecture. His father knows the dire condition this world is in right now. A volcano has literally just wiped out all food sources, and orcs freely roam the land. So he has to admit to himself that yes, Isildur is basically as good as dead. So in a way, this map is more important than the actual Rings of Power, since it is this map which ensures Isildur's survival, and Isildur is the guy Sauron actually needs to get the ring above everything else. I didn't think it was possible, but the writers have made me somehow care even less about the actual rings of power. Okay, enough of that nonsense. Let's look at this other nonsense. The writers have unfortunately learned nothing from the heckling they received in season 1 over wounds and traveling absurd distances. In season 1, Sauron was fatally wounded and traveled an absurd distance only to recover with the help of some very good elven magic. This is actually a little bit more forgiving since, he's actually a very, very powerful being. I can believe he can survive this kind of thing at least longer than the average mortal. Here, Isildur, a mere man who is not an incredibly powerful being, has a very dangerous wound and yet is just casually traveling on horseback and not in any real desperation to have his wound treated. This can mean only one of two things. Either Sauron now looks like Isildur, which is why he shrugged off a fatal stab wound, or the writers of the Rings of Power haven't given any thought to just how dangerous getting stabbed in the leg is for mere mortals. I'm guessing it's the second of these, which means that the writers of the Rings of Power, who are supposed to be writing all day and inventing and debating different scenarios for character introductions and story arcs and exciting story avenues, aren't doing this at all. In fact, based on what I've seen so far, it seems like the only thing they are doing is rewatching the original Lord of the Rings movies. And I guess I can't blame them? Anyways, a more appropriate wound would have been like smashing his foot with a rock, which would have also given him the opportunity for a bit of a comedic effect, which is clearly what they wanted, without also dropping them into the Office universe instead of Tolkien's. So as they're wandering through this forest on the way to the old Numenorian settlement, they are ambushed. Isildur does nothing with his sword, and I'm wondering if maybe I'm not actually in a fantasy universe where knights duel and slay bandits all the time. This would actually be a great moment for Isildur to get in a few exciting slashes, but I'm not sure this version of him knows how to swing a sword at all. Instead, Arondir jumps out of the wagon and slays all the bandits, yet sadly he can't save Isildur's horse. And so as the horses led away, so too are my hopes of a thrilling story for Isildur. The only thing we can take away from Isildur at this point is as follows. He should have been a horse. After fucking around in the old Numenor settlement, he meets Theo and agrees to embark on a moonlit raid to recover his horse. There's tedious conversation by a fireside, which in the hierarchy of bad dialogue is the safest kind of conversation from the Rings of Power. It's either tedious, trying too hard to be poetic, which is usually comedic, or a big exposition dump, which as far as dumps go, is usually pretty shitty. They avoid epic speeches, witty banter, and clever riddles, which are the usual mainstays of the fantasy genre, and wonder why no one cares about this fantasy show. Anyways, in this instance of tedious chatting, Isildur says that he blames himself for his mother's death by drowning. He swam out too far and got caught in a riptide, and in saving his life, it cost her her own. This is supposed to be one of those big character revelations, but since we don't know who his mother is or how special their bond might have been, it's hard to see what the world lost and what Isildur lost. There was zero effort anywhere in season 1 or before we arrived at this moment to show even a flashback of some tender moments between Isildur and his mother that he holds close to his heart. So we can vibe with him, man. So he tells us he's come to this land to honor her sacrifice. I think there are better ways to motivate Isildur to travel to Middle-earth, but we wind up in a good place. He wants to do something singular, something special, something, dare I say, epic. And epic is what I'm here for. It's just too bad that for both of us, he's in the Rings of Power and not a real Lord of the Rings show, because it doesn't look like special and epic or what he's going to get in this season, if ever. Estrid, rather than encourage his desire to do something great, simply says, fuck all that nonsense, you have to accept what you did as a gift and go live your life, bro. Next, when she thinks the coast is clear, Estrid reveals a scar on her neck. It's the mark of Adar. For some reason, she puts the fiery blade to it and screams in agony and maybe just a little bit of ecstasy. We jump to the moonlit raid and Theo reveals to the group of wild men that he serves Adar, and we will never deal with that fact again throughout the rest of this season. The moonlit raid goes awry and Theo basically gets captured by something big, tall, and that drops petals. Yes, you already guessed it. But the characters of this show were written by idiots to be idiotic, to increase watch time so it can be reported to other idiots on conference calls to the idiots in banking that yes, people are wasting their time watching this series, and no, it's not a handful of YouTubers maniacally playing and rewinding each and every scene to track all the absolute absurdities our team of drooling ding dongs has put together in the worst way possible so as to increase watch time for people who gave up on this series a very long time ago, most likely after the first episode of season 1 based on the looks of things. Yeah, and in other news, Estrid's husband, the leader of the band of wildmen, has also been captured. Back at the settlement, I'm assuming the next day, Arondir confronts Estrid with a series of Socratic questions and uncovers that Estrid is a member of the Wildmen and bears Adar's mark. He explains to us that sometimes these thugs burn themselves to conceal the mark, just like she has done. First, I mean, her hair was already covering it. This wasn't even necessary. Second, the problem with having a brand is that it's meant to be an obvious sign. So basically, no matter what you do, it will always be visible. Here's a thought. Want to form a secret society of evil that can't easily be discovered? Don't force your members to have marks burned into their flesh. Or just be an evil society of spiders. No one seems to be talking about them at all. Anyways, Arondir karate kicks her pottery, and now that she's been revealed, she is forced to lead them to the Wildmen. Arondir sees petals for like the fourth time and finally deduces that it's a giant tree that has captured them all. The show really loves Arondir. He can do anything. Hell, he might even be as heroic as Isildur's horse. There's another exposition bomb, and it turns out that Estrid was going to lead them into a trap and that she's been in on it from the start, including the kidnapping of Isildur's horse, which really makes me hate her.
Would you rather I died in Mordor?
I don't know. Let me think.
Wandering through a very muddy path, we all know he's going to start sinking and get attacked by some monster in the mud. Sure enough, that happens. Arondir attempts to help him, but they are both drugged down in the mud. Estrid appears to flee, but actually grabs a stick, which lures a malnourished mud slug to the surface. This was already a predictable and boring fight scene, but the Rings of Power had to make it outright stupid as well. There's no reason for a creature that surreptitiously sleeps in the mud to ever show itself in such a profound manner. It presumably lies in the mud because it needs the element of surprise to actually kill its victims. Now that it's out of the mud, it has lost that crucial element of surprise and faces a potential lethal beating with a very large stick, which would also be humiliating when it has to tell the other monsters why it looks more lean than usual. But before we even take things that far, there's no reason to leap out of the mud to see who else might be up there to slaughter, especially after it's just drowned and killed 2 victims. I can potentially explain this away by the mudworm being totally enraged that something has disturbed its domain, but the whole point of being secretive is so that someone eventually disturbs your domain, which alerts you to the fact that a meal is available and you can drag them under and devour them. Which brings me to the point that they were both dragged under for a really long time, but I know they aren't dead because the show loves Arondir too much, and Isildur has to live because he's eventually going to chop off Sauron's finger. So hovering over this mud pit like either of them might have died isn't creating suspense, it's just annoying. And right on time, the boys emerge from below and slice up the slug. Actually, only Arondir does. Isildur still doesn't get to do anything cool with his weapon. Is there anything Arondir can't do? I mean, besides like save his own wife?
There are nameless things in the deep places of this world. This one we shall call supper.
I'm okay with this line. It was totally out of character for Arondir, still not really of this universe, but at this point, I just want to laugh, and who better to accomplish this feat than Arondir the Awesome? Brace yourselves, folks, because later that evening, Estrid is sitting alone by the fire. She's helped him, so Arondir the Awesome tosses the key to her and says it's literally Isildur's choice to free her or not. This should be a very important decision for our friend Isildur. She's tried to kill him once, but at least she's also tried to save him once. But when she saved him, I mean, did she really have any choice? Being handcuffed and alone in a swamp full of evil things? seems like it was more self-serving than any real act of contrition. Isildur disregards all of that because he wants some of that Adar wild man forbidden fruit and doesn't give her previous betrayal, which was quite extensive, even a passing thought, after literally demanding time to think about it. So he leans in for a kiss and she pulls out his sword. I'm not reading smut. She unsheaths his blade and holds it at his throat. She knows the people can never forgive her, but it's actually the forest that strikes her. Yes, she gets mauled by a gigantic tree. It's about to stomp her out for good, but Isildur shields his crush from the fatal stomp. Just like any character in the Rings of Power, the trees have a lot of explaining to do. Only they are actually quite efficient with their speech, which is hilarious because one of the traits of Ents, which is what this thing is their complex language and long-winded answers. If there was any time where the henchmen of Melkor writing the Rings of Power should have absolutely let it rip with exposition, with trees talking for absurdly long times, it should be now. But they absolutely miss it. So the trees quickly explain that they have come to fight the army of orcs who have been destroying the forest. What of the spiders? Looks like they're still going to get away with it all. Anyways, after Arondir the Awesome whispers sweet nothings to the treants and strokes their bark just the way they like it, they release their captured, which includes Theo. Isildur goes in for a victory kiss, maybe even hoping to get his sword pulled out of the sheath for real this time, but it turns out Estrid's fiancé has survived. She embraces her wild man and Isildur stumbles away bitter and resentful. You really can't help but feel sorry for this guy. After all this, I really can't blame him for wanting to keep the One Ring to himself. And I think that's the whole point of this show now, to demonstrate just how miserable this guy's life had been up to this point, that he would need the most evil artifact ever created just to get a few W's. When next we see him, Isildur is just fucking around in some hut in a Númenórean settlement. He and Theo talk about their mommy issues, then Theo fucks off and Estrid enters the hut. In some really bland dialogue, she admits her kind of love for Isildur after telling him that her husband has built a house for her. And just like that, Isildur has stolen a man's wife. Then in true Rings of Power fashion, the fuckery starts flying all over the place. Pharazôn's son shows up at the Númenórean settlement because the plot needs someone from Númenor to show up and take Isildur home. Cherry on top here is that Númenor is apparently entering its expansionist era and really wants to revitalize this settlement in a vain project of gentrification. Now, if you know this entire land is falling to ruin and you have a thriving city safely tucked away in the ocean, you probably want to avoid a place that is threatened by an ancient evil so potent that the very gods of this universe had a hard time confronting it. If the men of Amazon's Middle-earth make these kinds of decisions without the Rings of Power, I really don't think Ronnie needs to spend all his time in his own putrid blood crafting them. Anyways, Pharazôn's son embraces Isildur, tells him he never gave up hope, and then confirms that he can take him back to Númenor. That shouldn't be a problem. Right in front of Estrid's husband, Isildur asks if there's room for this hot piece of wild peasant ass he found in the Black Forest on the boat. Now keep in mind, her husband was the leader of a group of people literally called wild men, who are essentially a band of unsavory outlaws. In response to his wife being whisked away by another man, he simply stares at the ground. This makes absolutely no sense. I've typed this phrase so many times that autocomplete has registered the whole goddamn sentence. Nothing happens here. No fight between Isildur and the cucked wild man. Then, the most shameless disregard for continuity I have ever seen happens. Pharazôn's son, completely unprompted, says actually there's no room on the ship, especially for peasants, and that Isildur's father is wanted for treason, and oh, by the way, he wishes his father was dead. What the what? Literally just moments ago, he was fine with Isildur coming back and was embracing him as a friend. After a brief shove, Isildur hops on the boat and fucks off back to Númenor alone. Not as a prisoner, just some random guy on a boat headed back to Númenor, and Estrid is left with her husband to presumably toil away in a loveless marriage. Woo! Season 2 of Rings of Power was humiliating for Isildur, but great for his horse. Isildur kind of falls in love with a girl who is already engaged, and she kind of falls in love with him, but in the end, the will they, won't they cuckold her husband story gets cock-blocked by Pharazôn's son. Isildur has to be saved from spiders by his horse. He gets stabbed in the thigh because he was too stupid to check inside a tent. He gets ambushed but doesn't dazzle us with his swordsmanship, and he's sucked off by a bug into the depths of mud when he wants to be sucked off by another man's future wife. There's nothing heroic about this guy at all, but here's the thing, there's nothing anti-heroic about him either. He's just shitty. Even ripping off Aragorn's story from the original movie can't make him interesting. So huge questions still linger for season 3. Is the horse more important than Isildur? How much more territory can the spiders take over? Is Isildur a Lothario who spends his time wooing all the married women of Middle-earth to his Isle of Pleasure? Will he keep the ring to conjure ever greater stamina for his continuous cuckery of Middle-earth? Is he a dashing swordsman destined to have all of his glory stolen from him by Arondir the Awesome? Is he a brooding warrior in exile just like Aragorn? I'm starting to really see how this guy could want to use the One Ring for himself. I mean, after this season, can you really blame him? Well, this isn't the most heroic direction they could have taken him. It's definitely plausible. If they keep heading down this path, Isildur will just be another weak-willed human out for his own gain. The one good thing he will have done in his entire life will essentially be an accident, slicing off Sauron's finger, and then he will die miserably in a swamp. It's a dark, cynical interpretation of Isildur, and for the rest of this series, he will only become mostly repulsive and unlikable. There won't be anything legendary about him, unless of course you're talking about his horse.